please let us know if you have news or new awards that come through. We want to share this with the community in an effort and in a hope that we become increasingly aware and involved in what each other is doing. That is major focus or major purpose of this particular seminar. The other piece is we want our group to continue to grow, and we have been. We've talked about just a moment ago new faculty pairs that are going to be developing over the course of this semester or the course of this year. So we're excited to add to our IDD research community. We're also excited to add reaching out to individuals that already are here at KU and at the Med Center. So please share these announcements with colleagues if you feel like they may be interested, or even if you feel like maybe they're not going to be interested, but I'm going to make them come. We're okay with that. I don't know how to get rid of this.
Dropping in the middle.
Yes. So this is our first hybrid meeting, I should say. And so, so far it has felt like our first hybrid meeting.
You're on the
So really important that everybody's here. Dr. Brady. So if anybody doesn't know, but I'm going to reiterate it. Dr. Brady is professor of speech language, hearing, sciences, and disorders. I have to say, remembering that the department title is always the most. She's also a senior scientist within the Lifespan Institute and a fellow of American Speech Language Hearing Association, ASHA. She's a certified speech language pathologist. And as many of you know, Dr. Brady's research focuses on how pre-speech communication is related to language development in individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders, as well as individuals with different sensory impairments. She has over 60 peer-reviewed publications, as well as book chapters. She's very helpful in getting our seminars ready by even closing doors when it's her own talk. She should be doing that. Thank you. And she's been funded by NIH, U.S. Department of Education. Autism Speaks throughout her career, including 2 newly awarded ones, one of which will be the focus of today's talk on identifying children at risk for remaining non-speaking. So I'm very grateful Dr. Brady agreed to offer us our first hybrid seminar and to do this talk, and so look forward to hearing about it. Thank you, Dr. Brady.
Thanks, Matt. So yes, what I'm going to talk about today is one of the new grants and focusing on early identification of children at risk or children with autism at risk for remaining minimally verbal. So to start with, I'm going to just talk a little bit about terminology. I think it's kind of a good thing to kind of do these days. So I'm going to actually use probably children with autism instead of autistic children in my talk, partly because that's written throughout the whole grant. And also because for the last 30 years, I've been programming myself to say people with autism. So it's a little bit more natural for me. Totally supportive of neurodiversity. And it's not any reflection on that. So I hope that that will fly okay with people. And then I'm also, the term minimally verbal itself also has kind of some baggage that goes along with it. And I noticed that even Matt said non-speaking. So, and those of us that kind of worked and developed this term, of course, did not mean for it to be a limiting term, but it's also throughout the grant, so I'm gonna probably continue to use it too. In terms of who our target population is and who I'm gonna be focusing on, it's individuals with autism that use few or no spoken words to communicate. And I have a short video that I'm going to attempt to play through this hybrid format. That's just so you can kind of get some grounding for the type of folks that I am working with on this grant and have been for a very long time. Okay, let's see if I get out of this and pull up. Maybe it's over here. Oops. Is it open? There it is. No sounds.
Dr. Brady, if you could unshare your screen and reshare it. It looks like you're sharing just your PowerPoint window right now, so we can't see your whole screen.
Okay.
Oh, I can see. I can kind of see what's going on from your.
Can you see
Here, we can actually, let's go ahead and do this. The beauty of technology. What are we going to do? I'm going to do. So Zoom implemented this. I don't know, but we can either share the screen or share the actual.
Oh, okay. Let's do the actual.
Yeah.
Oh, where's down here? Awesome.
Okay. Actually, but I want to do this. Share Zoom.
You guys seeing the video now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Hopefully there'll be some sound. Okay, so this is just one of the participants from a past study, and he's participating in an assessment that my colleagues and I developed called the Communication Complexity Scale, which is designed to identify ways that individuals communicate with whatever means they have available, including gestures and vocalizations. And I'm just going to show a short clip of one of the tasks, which is playing with bubbles, and you'll see a nice kind of example of him using many different ways to communicate.
Noticing
Down here?
Yeah. Not that one, but the actual.
Oh, okay, now wait. I know. It takes a real absolutely. Okay, let's see if we have any sound now.
Now the markers.
I don't.
Yeah, bubbles.
Okay, well, for whatever reason, technology is. Oh,
There they go. Pop, pop. Here. You open yours.
Still can't hear it. That's okay. He's actually a very
What? You pointed to bubbles.
Pointed to a symbol for bubbles.
Let's see. Let's see if we can open your bubbles. There. Put it on the table. Yeah. Oh, I opened them, but no bubbles inside. Let's see if we should open mine again. Here we
Try
go.
one more thing.
We can use mine. Cool. You try. You can blow. Go. No? Oop. One more time. Cool. Got it. What? Oh, you pointed to the bubble sign again. More bubbles. And you pointed to the I want sign. I can blow more. There they go. Woo! Cool. Bubbles are fun. See you later, Bubbles. Oh, thank you for helping. I've got a cool book. Thomas book.
Okay, after all that, that's all I'm going to show you. That's a great little communicator without speech, and but using lots of other means to communicate. And again, so is this what I want them to show? No.
Yeah, display setting.
Swap. Ta-da!
There you go.
And by the end of this, I'll know what I'm doing. Okay.
Make one of us.
All right, so now hopefully we have kind of some idea of the kinds of kids that I'm talking about, and not necessarily just kids, but the focus of this current project is on younger children. Okay, so this is kind of an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Kind of probably looks like the structure of a grant because it's pretty much going through the whole the grant that we just were awarded. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why it's important to identify kids who are minimally verbal or non-speaking very early so that we can have some impact. And then I'm going to, towards that end, review, it's a very selective review of just a few articles that demonstrated the importance of different social communication behaviors that are highly predictive of later language development. And then we'll launch into talking about the studies for the new R01. And again, this was just awarded in August, so we're kind of in the startup stage. So everything is rosy, right? Everything is as planned on paper, but really looking forward to getting some input from you guys, particularly with some challenges that we know we're going to face, like with recruitment, et cetera. And then I'll end with some conclusions and some possible next steps. And I usually like to take questions as they come up, so feel free. If you have questions, the Zoom crowd, I may not see you do anything there. I won't be monitoring the chat, but you can, raise one of those fake hands or unmic yourselves or whatever. And I'll pause a couple times for questions too, but don't feel you have to wait and hold them.
I can monitor the chat if anyone is more comfortable typing their questions there as well.
Awesome, thank you, Cassie. Okay, so why do we care about identifying kids at risk for being minimally verbal or as early as possible? So just in terms of some stats and some prevalence, so we know that as many as 1/3 of children with autism do remain minimally verbal as they get over age 5. And in terms of terminology, some people have reserved that term minimally verbal till kids are like 5 or older and use the term pre-verbal. I know Connie Cassery prefers that for younger than age 3 to 4 anyway. But I'm going to kind of mix them up a little bit. So, so 1/3 of the kids with autism, and as many as 1 out of 44 kids are getting diagnosed with autism right now. So it's not a really rare, small group. When I kind of first started getting interested in kids who are non-speaking with autism, they were not very, it didn't seem like it was very prevalent. And I was always kind of making the case that this is really an important understudy group. And I feel like that case has been made now. And I'm part of a group actually working with NIH to have a second conference that's going to be all focused on minimally verbal or whatever we end up calling the conference's next go around too. So there is definitely a recognized need because there's so many individuals out there. And in terms of the importance for quality of life, we know that language is a really important key variable for predicting quality of life and outcomes like where individuals end up in school and education, different types of job placements, different family and living situations are all linked with language outcomes. So language is really, really an important key variable to get a hold of early on. And also, pertinent to this grant, if we can identify kids early on, then we would like to get them as early as possible to jump in and to do some targeted interventions. And those interventions might include AAC interventions. It could be some interventions on some specific components that you'll see reflected in our measures and our different multimodal assessments. But definitely the key is to identify the kids early so that we can intervene and change some of those trajectories, not just say, oh, we can identify them early. So there is and again, as Matt said in my introduction, I'm a clinician, so I'm a clinician at heart. I want to get in and change some of these language outcomes for kids, if possible, through this work. Okay, so there has been a lot of work already done on predicting language outcomes in individuals with autism and in individuals that don't have autism. So in terms of pre-linguistic behavior or pre-linguistic social communication behavior, what I'm talking about are ways that people communicate without speech. So use of gestures, doing phrases here. Early vocalizations that are not words, but could be babbling or non-speech vocalizations. Most of you in autism, I'm sure, are well aware of the importance of joint attention. For communication, we're really looking at whether any of these behaviors I'm talking about are directed to another person. So that's where joint attention comes in. Play behaviors are really important for, are also often indicators of pre-linguistics or social communication, particularly symbolic play has been linked to language outcomes too. So those are the kinds of behaviors I'm talking about. There was a study by Mata and colleagues in 2016, which was with typically developing kids, and it was a large Finnish study, had like 487 kids, and they started measuring or observing the kids when they were 6 months old and followed them like through first grade. Their 6-month-old measures were a little bit limited. So the measures of pre-linguistic behaviors was a parent checklist. It was a Finnish version of like the communication symbolic behavior scales parent checklist, for those of you who are familiar with that. But still, they found that these early skills, as indicated on this parent report, were predictive of the kid's language at age 6. So going through first grade. So this was an important study showing that link between the early social communication, non-linguistic behaviors, and the later language outcomes. So they found links between gaze following, different gestures, imitation, language comprehension, which I'm going to come back to, symbolic play, how often kids communicated, again, according to parent report, and reciprocity, or that back and forth exchange in early social communication, which doesn't necessarily have to include words. And then I pulled out this one quote that was particularly important, I think. A slow pace of development across multiple skills in particular led to weaker language skills. So you'll see as I go along, this whole theme that we're following in this grant is looking at multimodal and interconnections between different aspects of pre-linguistic behavior. So again, a lot of earlier or other studies by myself and others have looked at maybe single behaviors at a single point in time, predicting growth in a particular outcome. But again, so remember this importance of multiple skills. Another study that I wanted to point out was done by Ball and colleagues in 2020. And this study was with children with autism, and they looked at 86 children with autism at age 3. They were identified at age 3, and then they were followed clinically as they got older. And they identified a group at age somewhere between ages 9 and 19 who were still minimally verbal. So they wanted to see what we're going back retrospectively, which is how a lot of these studies have been done, look back at record reviews to see, is there something in the files that we can dig up that would indicate that there was some likelihood for these kids to end up being minimally verbal. And interestingly, so you motor people, they identified the fine motor scores on the Mullen scales of early learning were the best predictor for remaining minimally verbal. So that those who had really extremely low scores on the MSEL, fine motor skills, where the kids ended up being minimally verbal. So now you won't see motor skills actually reflected in our multimodal measures, except for, I think that the link is that we are looking at speech sound skills, which is a fine motor skill, and a fine motor skill that's really directly linked, obviously, to speech production too. Okay, and then in terms of speech sound production, I was going to just mention a study that we did last year, actually came out last year. And again, thinking about the importance of speech sound production skills. And this is a skill that often is really not looked at very well. Some people have looked at the importance of imitation or speech imitation, but how well are kids producing different sounds that are the building blocks for words, and is that predictive? So we had a kind of aborted clinical trial due to COVID, but oh, my son is trying to call me. Sorry about that. Forgot to silence that in all of the getting ready part. So Christine Kosbrook, who's on the call, was the project coordinator for that project. And we had an intervention study, and we looked at whether the children's really speech sounds, I'm sorry, this is quite enough.
You can have an embarrassing break.
I know. And so at least I don't have an embarrassing ring. I was like, no, not yet. We figured out a scoring system to give credit for word approximations. So for example, if the target word we're trying to get in our probe was bat, the child said they got a better score than if they just said, oh, which, you know, this is not rocket science, but you would be, people have not really looked at how well kids are approximating different speech sounds as a predictor of learning new words. So we did find that there were significant correlations between those measures of speech sound production and the number of words that were learned in our intervention. And those phonemic scores were actually better predictors than the number of words the kids actually said. So there seemed to be something important about describing how well they were approximating words too. My colleague Jenna McDaniel and I also have looked at different types of speech sound production measures, and she just had, she's first author, just had an article come out that showed that looking at samples as short as 10 minutes and describing the number of phonemes that are produced in those samples is predictive also, and highly reliable. So an important thing to look at. Yes.
Do you know describing your sample for that last study?
Yes, they were kids between like 5 and 8, and they lived nearby, and they all had autism, and they would be described as minimally verbal at the beginning. So our goal was to teach them some new words and to focus on speech. And we had you'll probably get so tired of hearing me say multimodal. We had a multimodal approach to try to teach them the new words. So that incorporated AAC and focusing on some speech sound practice, etc. So
are there like certain screener that you guys use to establish like minimally verbal status?
Yes, we took a language sample and also parent report. So, and our cutoff, I think but you bring up a good question. So I didn't give you a vocabulary cutoff yet, but often in the literature, people will use a number like 40 or less single words as their cutoff. So if the child is saying less than 40 words, I think in this current grant we used 50. To me, it's more important that they're not combining words in like phrase speech. So very few kids are nonverbal, don't have any spoken words at all. Really, very few. But a lot of kids are in this area that we're focusing on. That they have, a few words, maybe 10, 20, but they're not really combining them. They're just kind of stuck at that level. Does that help?
Yeah, that's good.
I'm really glad that you asked that. It's a big clarification.
And Nancy, if you could, just if people do ask questions, you just repeat the questions. I'm not sure how well they can hear it on Zoom. So.
Okay, will do.
Thanks so much.
Okay, so then I'm just going to point out another study that I became aware of actually from working with my student from China, Min Lu, who's working on another paper looking at some data from this that they gave the CCS to 35 kids in China, but this is an article that she brought to my attention in writing up her research, and it's looking at gesture use and vocal use and combining gestures and vocals by kids with autism compared to kids without autism who are matched according to language age. There's small groups, there's only 11 in each group, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things that I think are interesting in these data. So even though there were some differences, I don't know if I dare move this. Anyway, in some of these different specific types of gestures, one that was significant, or the gestures that were significantly different, were reach and conventional gestures and instrumental. Now, an instrumental gesture is when a child takes your hand and puts it on a jar to open it, or takes your hand, takes you to a door and opens it. And you'll notice that they only saw these in the kids with autism, which totally matches my experiences too. So see those, what we call contact gestures, frequently in the kids with autism, but rarely in kids without autism.
Nancy, is that surprising to see the symbolic gesture?
Yeah, it was not statistically significant, but it was, yeah, that I don't really have an explanation for. Other than, yeah, so they matched them according to language age, and then, but the range in expressive vocabulary was from like 0 to 500. So it was kind of, yeah, very wide range. Okay, and then in terms of their vocalizations, when they were comparing the kids with autism to the kids without autism, not a whole lot of significant differences except for in echolalia, which you would expect, and also in other difference for other vocalizations, which was anything that was not kind of any of the above, not babbling, not word or word combination. But the most interesting thing, I think, is this last graph showing the proportion of utterances that were combined, a gaze plus a vocalization plus a gesture. So the high, those, for example, if a child held up something to you and while holding this up in your direction, that would be combining a gaze plus a vocalization plus a gesture. And those are really compelling gestures. It's hard for parents and communication partners to ignore, so they're really important. People usually tend to label what you are holding out to them, or if I hear something and I point to it and vocalize and look over. So those gestures were much more prevalent in the kids who were, actually you can't see the scale here, but it's that we saw them in the typically developing kids, and this one, but the lower bar is the kids with autism. So rarely saw those combinations in the kids with autism, and particularly in the kids who had higher vocabulary. So they broke them up into low and high vocabulary. So again, this multimodal communication is really important for differentiating the kids with autism from the kids without autism, even though they're matched on this expressive language measure. Okay, so then what about comprehension? I don't know, what about comprehension? Comprehension is really sticky. So if you think about kids that you probably all work with, there are many differences in terms of what we think they understand, how they seem to understand, words they understand, social relationships they understand. It's just so dang hard to measure. So we're going to give it a go in this grant, but measurement has really been quite a struggle. So researchers have developed some alternative methods using like eye gaze and some more tactile based measures, but that can help to some extent, but it still has really been problematic to try to measure comprehension for kids, like you saw in the video, who may not understand all the parameters of test taking that we assume for kids. But we know from most kids that comprehension is really, really important for expressive language development. Okay, so this is an old graph, but just to say that, again, you know, this is something that I and my colleagues have been kind of thinking about for a long time. And again, we know that, that gestures aren't important on their own and that it's not just comprehension, but that really all of these things kind of act together. And this was from an article that Kathy Tiemann-Burke and Candace Fleming and Chris Matthews and I published back in 2013, almost a decade ago. How did that happen? But it says structure, what's in front of you is a structural equation model. And in this study, we had 93 kids that we followed longitudinally. And for this analysis, we looked at the data at 1 year, you know, time 1 and then time 2, which occurred 1 year later. And they were preschool age kids at the time. And they did not all have autism, but they were all kind of at that beginning language stage. And they were all had some AAC on their instruction as part of their IEPs and instructional plans. So we measured the heck out of them and got a lot of information. We got the PLS auditory is the preschool language skills or auditory comprehension measure. We had a play scale that Kathy was key in developing. We had their Mullen scores, and then we used the communication complexity scale for measuring where they were in their complexity of communication. So as an anchor, if somebody was doing one of those combined gestures plus vocal plus eye gaze, they get like a 10, which is near the top of the scale. So that's kind of what that scale is meant to reflect. So after we got a lot of these data with help from Candace Fleming, our statistical consultant, we did a principal components analysis and found this group of behaviors that hung together that we refer to as intrinsic child predictor, or things that we measure that seem to be, you know, really getting at what the child brought to the language learning task. And then we also had some environmental measures. So we measured adult input at home and the amount of AAC instruction. And then our outcome measure was how many different words the kids said in 2 different contexts during a scripted interaction with a experimenter, and then also according to a parent report at home. So our analysis showed that this intrinsic child predictor was a significant predictor of their outcome. So that definitely made a difference. And adult input at home was a significant mediator. AAC instruction or input at school was not significant. However, as a little story for that, the amount of AAC instruction was very low in general. Amount of AAC use with these kids, I mean, like abysmal. You know, it was the classic, oh yeah, it's up in the shelf somewhere. And so they, even though they had AAC in their IEPs, they were not getting very much input in it. But we did document how much teachers reported using it on a weekly basis. Then some colleagues, or not colleagues, but some people approached me from Penn State last year and wanted to do a secondary analysis of these data, which, so it's kind of cool, those, you know, when you spend all this time depositing your data into a Endor type database and somebody actually, you know, wants to use it. So they did a secondary analysis and did a really important, made an important discovery that we had some actual pretty good diversity in this sample. And the Black children were getting significantly less AAC instruction than the non-Black children. These were all kids in our area. So it was kind of eye-opening. I had never, you know, we collected all the data. I didn't look at it that way. So anyway, a good plug for secondary data analysis and made me more willing to do all that data sharing that we have to do. So just to kind of summarize some of that without that last little story, we know that prelinguistic behaviors are associated with a diagnosis of autism, with later language outcomes in all kids, with later language outcomes in children with ASD, and again, development across these multiple elements seem particularly important. Okay, so that gets us to the current study, and these are my collaborators on the study. So Jim Ray is a computer scientist, engineer, really smart statistical guy. So that is really important because I'm gonna try to give you an overview of the computational modeling that we're proposing to use in this. But if you ask me a very technical question, I'm gonna say, boy, that's my Kofiai's world. And it's a really good partnership because he doesn't know very much about, you know, all the things that we're measuring. So, but Agata Broska is a developmental psychologist. Jenna McDaniel is SLP and also interested in early development. And then Olivia Gorham is a PhD student who has already been helping. She did the legwork on setting up a single IRB for a joint study. So I don't know if you want me to tell people you know how to do that. It was quite important. But very valuable already. So these are the specific aims of this project. So we wanted, and then some of this stuff I am going to read just because it's like not super in my area. So just to make sure I get it right. But we want to develop and validate a state-based models of development of attention, vocalizations, gestures, and comprehension. So those are the 4 dimensions that we're testing and measuring and looking for the growth within and across those 4 areas. And again, hopefully I kind of set the groundwork for why we picked those areas and why they are important, again, for predicting outcome. So we're going to construct a multidimensional model that unifies these individual models. Seriously, I am always envisioning Tinker sets, you know, for these different variables that are developing on their own and looking at progressions across time. And then the second aim is then to develop a predictive model to identify risks and generate a risk score so that we could better identify kids based on where they are and transitions, slow and fast, and dwell times within certain states that, again, could be predictive of whether the child is ends up minimally verbal or verbal. And we actually are just doing a bimodal distribution based on a cutoff of 50. I don't think it's going to be, I think it's going to be pretty bimodal at the end, but I'll talk a little bit about the modeling, and then I'm going to talk about some of the methods. And then, so that's where I'll talk about more the nitty-gritty stuff. But, so those are our 2 main specific aims. Okay, so this is where, again, this kind of overview, but we're using continuous time hidden Markov models. And these types of models make it possible to model prelinguistic communication development as a series of stages corresponding to developmental milestones. And they allow the developmental trajectories themselves to become potential predictors of communication outcomes. So rather than the one behavior at a state and time, we're looking at, you know, growth and these different trajectories. And for the first time, we hope to derive and quantitatively assess whether the timing of onset of these specific behaviors and the time between transitions can be identified as predictors of risk. And they form a framework for generating this quantifiable risk score. Any questions? No, good. No. Okay, So I do have a couple of illustrations. So this was we used this illustration in the grant, and in terms of kind of some preliminary data, thanks to Paul Yoder and Jenna McDaniel. These are data that Paul Yoder collected from one of his preschool intervention studies, and Jenna knew him and worked with him well and was able to get these data. So we did a very simple model to kind of show the relationships between two dimensions. So this is a two-dimensional model. And this is actually just comparing change in growth according to, in vocabulary, but according to two different measures. So it's looking at the CSBS expressive vocabulary, which was obtained from a live observation, well, not necessarily live, but anyway, in interactions where people actually counted how many words the child said, compared to the MacArthur-Bates, which is a parent report. So both of them looking at vocabulary. And if you look at these changes over time, what you would, okay. Oh, hey, whoa, okay, here we go. So if the kids are starting up here, this is at the 0, 0 state. So each of these numbers represent a different stage in that the GYM students figured out based on how many words were produced. So what you would want to see is the kids kind of progressing along the diagonal, right? So that they would be showing growth, in this case, in both measures, and end up somewhere down here producing lots of words on both measures. But as you can see, some of the kids are going along different paths where they might be showing more growth in one measure or another, and then eventually get back to this place, etc. So the way they drew that depicted this is that the number inside each node denotes the number of children that pass through that state. And the thickness and number inside the arrow denote the number of children who made that state-to-state transition. And then he also used this color coding to show how long they dwelled or stayed in a particular state. So again, for this, where we're just looking at two different measures, that's not super important. But if you think about movement across these different dimensions, being stuck or dwelling in one stage longer than we would expect may be actually predictive and associated with minimal verbal status. Okay, just a couple more. So that was the whole sample. And then when we divided them into the kids who were minimally verbal compared to the kids that developed some verbal language at the end of their study, you can see, quite different paths of going. Again, we have kids going along the diagonal, and here we have most of the kids. Okay, on the left-hand side, but most of the kids are getting stuck in that 0 to stage 1. So very few are kind of getting out of that. And then the definition was actually based on a different measure, so it's not completely circular. Okay, so I know little colored dots, and it's very abstract, but we're really talking about tracking growth and trajectories. And again, in this sample, it's just 2 dimensions. But we have 4 dimensions, and these are the actual what we're looking at in terms of attention, vocalizations, gestures, and comprehension. So you can see each one of those dimensions kind of and the levels that we've got mapped out for each one of them. So for attention, we have no focus of attention, which is probably not ever going to happen, but single focus, shared focus, dual focus, and triadic, kind of checking back and forth. And then for vocalizations, we've got from cries, going through the usual developmental progression of babbling, variegated babbling, words, etc. And then gestures, we also have a developmental progression from acting on objects to contact gestures, distal gestures, that point that we're always so interested in kids with autism, and representational gestures. And then a similar progression and comprehension. And we laid this out based on articles and typical development, and gave a developmental milestone for typical development at the very bottom. So if you like, for example, if you looked at a child at 9 months, a typically developing 9-month-old child, you would expect them to be showing triadic orientation, somewhere between deduplicated and variegated babbling, that you would look for contact gestures, maybe a distal gesture, and some joint references. So you would slice it vertically and expect them to be pretty much, within a range that way. But we don't know that with kids with autism, right? They're probably going to be all over the board. You're not going to, at least I would hypothesize, we're not going to see them all stuck at the same developmentally marked milestones. So that's part of what we're trying to figure out, is what are the trajectories that we're seeing across all of these different aspects of pre-linguistic communication. And so I like to, again, I'm very visual. So when I'm trying to think of, anyway, unlike the 2D representation, this is still a 2D picture, but it's of a 3D object. So if you imagine, your marble being a child at the beginning, and they are traveling down these different paths, and they could kind of, in this case, it's actually, I was staring at this way too long, but I think that this is probably the only real nodal decision point on this one, where we would end up going down one of these two paths. But so you can imagine ending up in one bucket would be your verbal kids, and the other bucket would be your minimally verbal kids. And we want to know where it is that they're getting stuck along all these different possible pathways. And if they're, not only getting stuck in one of them, but maybe just getting from here to here is taking too long. And so that's my little visual analogy. It would probably drive my computational scientist people crazy, but that's the kind of thing. Okay. So this is, and these are the methods. So we're going to have 100 kids with autism across the 3 sites. So I think this is very doable. So we're going to mostly be here and at Georgia Tech, and which is in Atlanta, which you would think that would be a great catchment area. They have all kinds of competition with the Marcus Center, and they're always fighting over the same kids. So they keep saying they really hope we get a lot of kids, and we're like, well, okay. So anyway, the hard thing I think is going to be, we're trying to identify kids as close to 18 months as we can. So they have to be between 18 and 36 months. And those of you who are in the area know that it can be tricky to get kids identified and diagnosed that young. And so I've been already working some with Brenda Sally and trying to figure out some ways to help with that identification early. We're getting our folks trained up to be ADOS reliable, so that hopefully that can be an incentive, have some more people out doing testing and help get them off wait lists. But if you guys have some suggestions to help with recruitment, we'd really love to hear those too. And again, so in terms of, we're going to see them every 3 months, but we're thinking we're going to set up a small lab. I think Olivia described it as a bunker over at Wakarusa. It's currently in the lactation room. So anyway, we don't need a whole lot of space, but as you know, Wakarusa is great for families because they can just drive right up. You don't have to try to figure out where you are on campus and go to the wrong building and all those things. So we've also been okay to have some space at the med center. So if we end up with more families, and we're pretty affordable too. I mean, for a lot of our assessments are in suitcases, so we can take them and set them up. And so anyway, we can do it here. And our new hire is actually from the Topeka area, so that's another kind of possibility too. So anyway, really, we'll look forward to any kind of suggestions that you guys have for recruitment help. And then, yep, so we're gonna, again, do all those measures that are listed below every 3 months. And then at age 60 months, we'll have our final outcome measure to see where they ended up. And then our colleagues will do all that fancy modeling to figure out where the kids are getting stuck along the way. So again, just to reiterate why we're doing all this, really I think that at the end we'll have a better way to detect kids who need different, maybe more intensive interventions at earlier ages or at particularly critical ages. And it may be AAC, or it may be focused on some of the components that we're focusing on. So really teaching kids to do some more specific gesture combinations and some more really focusing on their comprehension, or some things like that might be important early stages of intervention. And again, we're hoping to identify a state-based model of early communication development in children with autism, and looking for identification of, again, some specific targets that may be unique or in unique combinations too. Even though we haven't started this one yet, you have to think of future directions. So thinking about, again, maybe some specific interventions at specific times that we can focus in on. And when we were working on this grant, we had some consultation from Paul Yoder, who was very excited about this work too. And I thought he had some really interesting insight as somebody that's done a lot of early intervention work with this population. He thought that this was really important because the iterative process of trying one intervention, seeing whether it works or doesn't work, trying another intervention with a clinical trial, seeing if we're talking about decades of work. So this is an attempt to jumpstart and identify some variables with a more computational approach. So see if that is helpful and speed things along. So with that, I will end and take any questions that you guys may have.
Thanks so much, Andy. A couple pointers. If you don't mind just stopping the share.
Okay.
Because I think we actually have a large group of Zoom.
Oh, we do.
Not
okay.
just the few that are on camera that are shown on our screen. So we can maybe see all their faces, and people can actually raise their hands as well. And then in addition to that, I know there are a couple of items in the chat. So maybe we want to get the hardest part of getting that mouse to work. That is not.
If anybody sees it pop up, let me know.
Think how hard you slam it.
Did you see it?
Yeah.
Where?
Well, why don't you not worry about that? How about that? Cassie, I'll see if I can fix that, because you're the person that actually matters.
And Cassie, if you want to read the chat to me.
Sure. The main thing that came up earlier was just someone was wondering what AAC is, but another one of our colleagues went ahead and answered that.
Oh, good.
But if you want to explain any further about what AAC looks like or what different types of AAC are, that might be helpful.
Sure, we're talking about augmentative or alternative communication. So it could include, actually gestures are considered a form of AAC, but usually we think of something like using symbols to represent something, and it could be low tech, like you saw in my little video with using PEC symbols, high tech with using computer and voice activated systems are all forms of augmentative communication. So sign language is a form of augmentative communication that we don't see as much of anymore, but those are what we're talking about. Non-speech, but more systematic and kind of more formal than the gestures. I see another hand up.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have a lot of questions. This is great. So let's go with Rebecca, and then we'll open it up to the live audience. I guess we're all live.
Hi there. Sorry for my appearance. Somehow I left the office without my laptop, so I'm on my son's iPad for this talk. But I was curious, the kids in your study, will they be receiving language interventions on the side? Are they disqualified if they're getting language interventions, or?
Yeah, no, they are definitely not disqualified. Man, that would really be unethical.
Yeah, I was wondering if you're trying to see it should all 100 be getting interventions or a mixture?
They are, and we actually made a decision not to track the amount of intervention or type of intervention that they're getting. So it'll be a controlled variable, actually.
Okay.
We're not going to provide any intervention, and we're not actually going to track the interventions that they're getting. But based on what I know in this area, they should all be getting intervention, and most of them are going to be getting intervention in augmentative and alternative communications.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, probably less so in speech production. Hi, Heather. I see your hand up.
Hi, it was great learning about the other RO1 that you're working on. It's so cool. I was wondering, for recruitment into the study, are you looking for toddlers who have already been diagnosed or toddlers who are in the process?
Well, we would love it if they'd already been diagnosed. However, if they're on a waiting list and we can tactfully and politically figure out a way to help with that diagnosis and speed up the process, we would be willing to do that. So we're trying to kind of navigate those systems.
Great.
It sounds easy, doesn't it? Yeah, Raul.
Yeah.
Just kind of interested in the protocol you guys are using. So,
Raul's asking about the protocol.
oh yeah, so like, I guess 2 questions, which is, what's the expected duration of each session with each, more or less with each kid, and then which of those components are you guys going to be using eye tracking with to track like attention?
In terms of the length of time, I want to know how long each session was, and we did some piloting, and it was like, I don't know, about 2 hours. That would be my ballpark guess based on, well, it's not a guess, that's about how long we took. Yeah. Of course, we didn't know exactly what we were doing either, so, but more or less around that length of time. And then we're not using eye tracking in this study at all. However, Jim Ray, my colleague from Georgia Tech, he is sending some goggles with, so I don't know exactly what the answer to that is. So we're going to try out some goggles and see if it helps us actually with some determination, for example, during the comprehension assessments, if we can get a better idea of where the kids are looking when we name objects. But we're not going to do a formal eye tracking assessment like Megan does. Yeah. But yeah, it's a good question. He's like sending these goggles along. I'm like, okay, I'm not sure exactly what we're going to do with that, but we'll try them out.
Hey, Renee.
Hey,
Thank you. Hey, Nancy, always great to hear you talk and to hear about the work.
You're in a much funner place than me, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, that's, yes, for another time. But no, always great to hear about the work you're doing and the people that are working with you. So I have a big picture question for you, because you have so many years of experience and data around, kids with autism and limited verbal language. So my question is, what if, funding wasn't an issue? You had like unlimited dollars. Yeah, I know. So, but I really want to know, because you have so much experience and knowledge. What would you want to do or provide for kids with autism and minimal verbal language so they could make the best outcomes? Or what would you want to study? Like, what do you think would be the most meaningful impact? That's my question.
Yeah, that's really a good one. And that a lot of other people here would have some good answers too. But I think I would, I really think it kind of matters. I really appreciate differences within kids. So for some of the kids, they just need a system. They're just, anxious to, they're just going to go to town with a very advanced system. Some kids are going to really have a hard time using those because they are really struggling with some basic understanding of reciprocity and of what communication is all about. So I think it kind of depends on the kid. And what I want to get out of this and some other research is figuring out what assessments are going to tell me which kid is the first type and which kid is the second type. But so I don't have a really succinct answer for that.
No, I think that's great. That's what I would like. I mean, that's sometimes the hardest thing, right? Like figuring out, well, we know that it could be individualized.
Well, absolutely. And it's definitely not a one size fits all. So, and right now, I think we are treating them like it's a one size fits all. So that would be one way that I think that this could have a lot of impact is trying to figure out some, you know, we throw around the term prescriptive interventions, but that is, I think, what we need to do. Christine has her hand up too.
We're right at time to Dr. Brady. Okay, with one more question. Okay, we'll make this the last one.
Thanks, Nancy. Kind of going off of what Renee was asking, just based on your breadth of experience, what do you think are biggest obstacles to really studying comprehension and receptive languages in this population?
I think it's access. I think it's figuring out, you know, it's a way to tap into their understanding. I mean, we've talked about, you know, doing ERTs and it's that there's access. And then I think it's also the construct itself. When you say comprehension, I think of one set of behaviors. And so we could be talking about, you know, single word comprehension. We could be talking about comprehension of intonation, comprehension of social rules. It's such a kind of mixed construct too. But that's what I think is just tapping into access ways to measure it. So you and John can help.
So with that, we are at time. I want to thank Nancy, Dr. Brady.
I hope I left enough time for questions. I should talk faster. Anyway, thanks.
Part of that is my talk was excellent. I appreciate your time in doing it. A lot of good thoughts came out of this, at least for me. I have a lot of questions.
Good.
But thank you for doing it.
Yeah, thank you. And come in. Tell me where to find these kids.
One thing I was in touch. Fun doing.